Metallic grit coated Clifford's tongue, tasting intensely of lithium and burnt copper. Abandoned. Left to suffocate in the decaying belly of outpost Jericho, 3 million light-years from a sun he recognized. His crew had stripped the escape pods, taking the last oxygen reserves with them. Survival wasn't just statistically improbable, it was mathematically impossible. Yet as the station's core hummed its dying breath, a stubborn, jagged spite took root in his chest. Dying was easy. Spite required engineering. Nausea woke him before the cold did. Bile burned the back of Clifford's throat as he rolled onto his side, his cheek peeling away from the frosted metal deck. The grating beneath him vibrated with a sickening, uneven rhythm, the unmistakable shudder of a station, losing its atmospheric stabilizers. He didn't sit up right away. His left knee throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a sharp reminder of the bulkhead door that had slammed shut on his leg during the evacuation order. He pressed his palms flat against the deck. The metal was smooth, entirely devoid of the rivets and seams that characterized human engineering. Outpost Jericho was a captured asset, an architectural anomaly, built by a species that preferred sweeping, seamless curves and crystalline power conduits. It felt like living inside a massive, petrified mollusk shell. And right now that shell was freezing. Clifford forced himself up onto his good knee. The harsh sodium-orange emergency strobes cut through the encroaching darkness, casting long, erratic shadows across the primary engineering bay. "Tobias!" Clifford's voice was a dry croak. It sounded pathetic even to him. Silence answered. Not complete silence, but the heavy mechanical quiet of a void creeping in. The ambient hum of the atmospheric scrubbers was gone. The rhythmic thumping of the coolant pumps had ceased. He dragged himself toward the main terminal, his boots scraping loudly against the deck. The console was a slab of obsidian glass, dead and unresponsive. Clifford slapped his heavy grease-stained glove against the surface, smearing a mixture of hydraulic fluid and his own sweat across the glass. Nothing. Panic, cold and sharp as a scalpel, slid between his ribs. He didn't stoically assess the situation. He didn't clench his jaw in heroic determination. He stumbled back, his chest heaving, and threw up everything left in his stomach onto the pristine alien floor. He was alone. Tobias Mercer, his captain, his commanding officer for the last 5 years, had left him. Clifford remembered the klaxons blaring the whole breach, warning flashing on the retinal displays, the frantic scramble for the airlocks. He remembered pushing the heavy fusion core back into its housing so the ship could undock. He remembered Tobias looking him dead in the eye through the reinforced glass of the airlock, his hand hovering over the manual override. Tobias had calculated the odds. A localized core cascade in the station's lower decks threatened to consume the docking ring. Waiting for Clifford meant risking the ship. Tobias had hit the release. Clifford leaned against a cold support strut, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. He could taste the sourness of betrayal, but beneath it lay a cynical, ugly understanding. Tobias wasn't a monster. He was a pragmatist. In Tobias's shoes, Clifford might have run the same brutal calculus. It made him hate Tobias, more simply because the logic was unassailable. The ambient temperature was dropping fast. Clifford's breath bloomed into white puffs in the dim light. The atmospheric processors were dead, which meant he had roughly 3 hours before the carbon dioxide levels in the sealed bay induced narcosis, followed swiftly by death. He slid down the strut, sitting heavily on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He closed his eyes. It would be so easy to just stay here. The cold would numb him. The CO2 would put him to sleep. It was a peaceful way to go, all things considered. Then a faint, high-pitched whine reached his ears. It was coming from beneath the deck plates. A sub-relay. The alien station wasn't entirely dead. It was in hibernation mode, rerouting its dwindling plasma reserves to the deepest, most secure sectors. Clifford opened his eyes. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, thick-knuckled, permanently stained with carbon scoring and grease. They were the hands of a mechanic who had spent a lifetime fixing broken things that other people threw away. A quiet, furious energy began to uncoil in his gut. He didn't care about duty. He didn't care about the mission. He cared that Tobias Mercer was currently sitting in a comfortable pilot's chair, feeling guilty, drinking synthesized coffee, and believing Clifford was a tragic casualty of war. Screw that. Clifford pushed himself up his bad knee, screaming in protest. He limped over to his heavy canvas tool bag, kicked into a corner during the panic. He unzipped it. The familiar smell of gun oil ozone and old metal hit his nose, a smell like home. He pulled out a heavy magnetic pry bar and a diagnostic tablet. "All right, you overgrown seashell," Clifford muttered, his voice shaking but finding its center. "Let's see what makes you tick." He approached the nearest bulkhead panel. Alien architecture didn't use screws or bolts. The panels were held together by electromagnetic tension. Clifford jammed the flat edge of the pry bar into a micro seam that looked barely wide enough to hold a piece of paper. He leaned his entire body weight onto the bar, gritting his teeth. Metal groaned. The pry bar slipped, tearing a wide gash through the thick fabric of his jumpsuit and biting into his forearm. Clifford hissed, tasting copper as he bit his tongue, but he didn't stop. He wedged his boot against the wall, adjusted his grip, and pulled until his shoulders popped. With a deafening crack, the electromagnetic seal broke. The panel flew off, clattering loudly against the opposite wall. Clifford peered inside. Instead of wires and circuit boards, the wall cavity was filled with translucent vein-like tubes, pulsing with a sluggish, viscous blue fluid. Crystalline nodes acted as relays, suspended in a semi-organic, gelatinous matrix. It was beautiful. It was highly advanced. It made absolutely no sense to a human engineer. Clifford smiled, a grim, humorless stretching of his cracked lips. Challenge accepted. Time lost its meaning, replaced by the rhythm of desperate labor. Clifford's hands were covered in a mixture of his own dried blood and the viscous blue thermal paste that leaked from the station's severed conduits. The temperature in the engineering bay had plummeted to near freezing. Ice crystals were forming on the edges of the obsidian consoles. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. He had spent what he guessed was 2 hours trying to interface his human-built diagnostic tablet with the alien crystalline nodes. The fundamental principles of electricity still applied. Electrons had to move from a higher potential to a lower one. But the medium was entirely alien. The architects didn't use copper or fiber optics. They used resonating frequencies and photoconductive fluid. Clifford sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by gutted human tech. He had completely disassembled his own emergency rebreather, stripping the copper coils from its motor. "You need a bridge," he whispered to himself, his voice raspy. The CO2 was building up. He felt the familiar dull ache of an impending headache tightening around his temples. His thoughts were starting to drift, becoming fuzzy and disconnected. He slapped his own face, hard. The sting grounded him. Focus. Bridge the gap. He took a jagged piece of broken quartz from one of the shattered alien nodes. It glowed faintly, a dying ember of blue light. He wrapped the raw, uninsulated copper wire from the rebreather around the base of the crystal. He needed to connect this jerry-rigged node into the main environmental control line, which was a thick, pulsing artery of blue fluid running along the ceiling. He dragged a supply crate over, climbed on top, and reached up. His muscles screamed with fatigue. He held a high-voltage splicing tool in his teeth. The alien artery was slick, defying friction. Clifford carefully made an incision with his utility knife. The moment the blade pierced the membrane, A spark of pure, raw static leaped out, shocking his hand. Clifford yelled, dropping the knife. The jolt traveled up his arm, stopping his heart for a terrifying microsecond before it slammed back into a frantic, irregular rhythm. The smell of burning hair and ozone filled the space around him. His fingers were numb, the skin blackened and blistered across his palm. He leaned his forehead against the freezing metal of the ceiling strut, panting heavily. The urge to quit washed over him, heavy and seductive. He could just lie down. The cold wasn't so bad anymore. It actually felt kind of warm. Hypothermia, his brain recognized sluggishly. "You're dying, Clifford." He thought of Tobias again. He pictured Tobias writing the official incident report. Engineer Clifford Murray was lost during a localized core cascade. He performed his duties until the end. "Like hell I did." Clifford snarled the words, slurring slightly. He ignored the blistering pain in his right hand, using his left to jam the copper-wrapped quartz crystal directly into the bleeding incision in the alien artery. The reaction was instantaneous. The station violently rejected the crude physical intrusion of human metal. A high-pitched squeal echoed through the bay like twisting steel. The blue fluid in the artery began to boil around the copper wire. Clifford pulled the diagnostic tablet from his belt. He had spliced the other end of the copper wire to the tablet's input. Jack. The screen flickered wildly lines of human code, trying desperately to translate the frantic organic pulses of the alien station. "Come on, translate!" Clifford begged, hammering his good hand against the tablet. "Speak English, you bastard!" He pulled up the power distribution schematics he had managed to dump from the station's memory earlier. He couldn't read the alien syntax, but he understood flow. He understood pressure. He bypassed the software entirely, opening the tablet's casing and using a multi-tool to physically cross the circuit pathways on the motherboard, forcing an electrical surge back up the copper wire. He was attacking the station's nervous system with a sledgehammer. A massive shower of sparks erupted from the ceiling. Clifford squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away as hot metal rained down on his shoulders. Then a deep, resonant thud shook the floor. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It sounded like a massive heartbeat. The sodium-orange emergency strobes flickered and died. For a long, terrifying second, Clifford was plunged into absolute crushing darkness. He held his breath, waiting for the final failure, waiting for the vacuum to claim him. Instead, a soft, warm hum vibrated through the soles of his boots. Above him, the obsidian panels flickered. Not with alien blue or green, but with a harsh, industrial human yellow. The fans in the walls ground to life, protesting violently, screaming as metal scraped against metal, but they turned. A vent above his head hissed, spitting out a cloud of stale, metallic-tasting air. It smelled like ancient dust and burning copper, but it was oxygen. Clifford collapsed off the crate landing hard on his back. He lay there staring at the yellow lights, taking deep, ragged breaths of the filthy air. He was laughing a hoarse, broken sound that echoed in the vast, empty bay. He had forced the station to breathe. It was a butchered, ugly patch job, but it held. He wasn't dead yet, but the victory was hollow. The diagnostic tablet beeped a shrill warning tone. Clifford picked it up, squinting at the cracked screen. The environmental patch was drawing power from the secondary reserve cells. They were bleeding out fast. He had air, but only for another 12 hours. To survive, to actually keep this rotting carcass of a station alive, he needed main power. He needed to restart the fusion core in the lower decks. Clifford sat up, binding his burned hand with a strip of cloth torn from his ruined jumpsuit. The spite was still there, but it had hardened into something cold and methodical. He was no longer just trying to survive. He was going to gut this station and rebuild it in his own image. The descent into the lower levels was a slow, agonizing crawl through a graveyard. Clifford navigated the maintenance shafts. Gravity in this sector was fluctuating wildly. One moment he weighed 300 pounds, dragging his boots across the deck like lead weights. The next he was nearly weightless, pushing himself off bulkheads to glide over tangled nests of dead conduits. The architecture here was rougher, more utilitarian, though still bearing the smooth, geometric hallmarks of the architects. The walls were lined with dormant stasis pods, towering obelisks of opaque glass. This was the detention block. Outpost Jericho hadn't just been a military listening post, it had been a prison. Clifford's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating thick layers of floating particulate matter. He kept his pry bar gripped tightly in his good hand. The silence here was oppressive, thick enough to choke on. As he passed a row of containment cells, a subtle sound broke the quiet. Tap, tap, tap. Clifford froze. He aimed the flashlight down the corridor. The beam caught the surface of a containment door. The glass was shattered, radiating outward from a central impact point, but the electromagnetic lock was still engaged. He approached slowly, his boots silently connecting with the deck under a sudden shift to low gravity. Inside the cell, slumped against the back wall, was a figure. It wasn't an architect. The architects were massive insectoid things, all chitin and sharp angles. This creature was roughly humanoid, clad in a ragged dark uniform that looked remarkably similar to standard-issue mercenary gear, though tailored for a frame with an extra set of joints in the legs. His skin was a mottled, bruised grey, and a viscous, glowing cyan fluid was smeared across his chest blood. The alien's eyes, completely black and devoid of sclera, locked onto Clifford. He raised a trembling hand and weakly tapped a metal ring against the glass again. Tap. Clifford stared. He had spent his whole life fixing machines. Machines made sense. They followed rules. Biology was messy, unpredictable, and usually fatal. He should walk away. He was on a ticking clock. He didn't have the resources to save himself, let alone a dying alien prisoner. But as Clifford looked at the alien, he saw the exhaustion. He saw the cynical acceptance of the end in those solid black eyes. This guy had been left behind, too, left to rot in a cell by whoever evacuated the station, deemed unworthy of the cargo space. Clifford felt that familiar, jagged spite flare up again. "Move back," Clifford said, his voice echoing loudly in the empty hall. He gestured with his pry bar. The alien didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. He slowly dragged himself away from the door. Clifford jammed the pry bar into the locking mechanism. This door was heavily armored. Leverage wasn't going to work. He needed to short it out. He pulled his modified diagnostic tablet, unwinding a length of the scorched copper wire he had used in the engineering bay. He jammed the bare wire directly into the locking node and hit the power surge. The lock exploded in a shower of blue sparks. The heavy glass door slid open with a grinding screech, stopping halfway, as its tracks seized. Clifford squeezed through the gap. The smell inside the cell was awful, a mix of ammonia, copper, and something that smelled like rotting fruit. He knelt beside the alien. Up close, the damage was severe. The cyan blood was pulsing weakly from a deep laceration on the alien's side. Clifford pulled a standard human medkit from his belt. "I don't know if this coagulant will work on whatever you're pumping," Clifford muttered, ripping open a packet of biofoam. "But it's better than bleeding out." He pressed the foam directly into the wound. The alien let out a sharp, rattling hiss, his grey hands grabbing Clifford's wrists with surprising strength. The foam bubbled, turning a violent shade of purple as it reacted with the cyan blood. But it rapidly hardened, sealing the breach. The alien slumped back, panting. He looked at Clifford, his black eyes tracking the human's movements. He tapped his chest, then made a low clicking sound in his throat that roughly sounded like a name. "Yeah, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that." Clifford said, sitting back on his heels and wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at the alien. He had the rugged, battered look of a career soldier. "I'm going to call you Rowan. Had a drill sergeant named Rowan once. You look just as ugly." Rowan stared at him, then let out a short, clicking exhalation that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "Can you walk?" Clifford asked, panting. He pointed down the corridor towards the reactor level. "Core. Power. I need to fix it, or we both die." Rowan seemed to understand the urgency. He nodded slowly, grabbing the wall and dragging himself upright. He stood a full head taller than Clifford, though he walked with a severe limp. Together, the two abandoned ghosts moved deeper into the machine. The core room was massive, a spherical cavern housing a suspended fusion reactor that looked like a giant, dormant mechanical heart. The gravity here was completely gone. Clifford and Rowan floated near the entrance, gripping the handrails. The reactor was encased in a shell of crystalline armor. The core itself wasn't dead. It was locked in a localized stasis field, a safety measure initiated during the evacuation. They locked it down. Clifford breathed his breath, visible in the freezing air. "I need to break the stasis field." Rowan pointed a long grey finger at a series of 4 primary control consoles floating around the room's equator. He held up 4 fingers, then made a twisting motion with his hands. "Simultaneous, manual override," Clifford translated. "Great. There's only 2 of us." Clifford pushed himself off the wall, floating toward the nearest console. He tethered himself to the floor, using a magnetic grapple. He looked at the alien interface. It was complex, requiring a specific sequence of resonating frequencies to unlock. "I don't have time for a puzzle box," Clifford muttered. He pulled out a heavy industrial wrench and slammed it into the center of the crystalline console. The glass shattered. Clifford dug his hands into the glowing, gelatinous guts of the machine. He didn't need to enter the code. He just needed to bypass the gate. He pulled a thick bundle of his own human-made copper wire from his bag. He was going to daisy-chain the consoles together. He moved rapidly, pushing off bulkheads, stringing the crude copper wire across the pristine alien architecture like a spider spinning a ragged web. Rowan watched, his black eyes wide with what looked like horror. Clifford was committing engineering heresy. He was violating every safety protocol, forcing incompatible technologies to mate through sheer brute force. Clifford finished the circuit, tying the final wire into his diagnostic tablet. He floated back to the main breaker. "Rowan!" Clifford yelled, pointing to the manual release lever on the reactor housing. "When I hit the surge, pull that lever. Pull it hard." Rowan anchored his boots to the reactor casing, gripping the lever with both hands. He nodded. Clifford looked at his tablet. The battery was at 3%. This was going to be a massive draw. If the copper wire melted before the signal reached all 4 consoles, the stasis field would rebound, and the core would detonate, vaporizing them instantly. Clifford didn't close his eyes. He stared the giant machine down. "Wake up, you son of a bitch," Clifford whispered. He slammed his thumb onto the execute command. The copper wire strung across the room instantly glowed cherry red, smoking violently as massive voltage ripped through it. The smell of burning rubber and melting metal flooded the chamber. Clack, 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 clack. The 4 consoles short-circuited simultaneously. "Now!" Clifford roared. Rowan threw his entire body weight backward, wrenching the heavy manual release lever. The stasis field shattered with a sound like a thunderclap. The shockwave threw Clifford backward, slamming him hard against the rear bulkhead. The wind was knocked out of his lungs in a violent rush. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. Then the mechanical heart began to beat. It started as a low subsonic vibration that rattled Clifford's teeth, building into a deafening roar. The massive fusion core ignited, but it didn't glow with the serene, cool blue light of the architects. The raw, unfiltered influx of human electrical bypasses had altered its frequency. The core burned with an aggressive, blinding, furious human gold. Warmth exploded outward, a physical wave that swept away the freezing cold. The ambient lights in the chamber snapped on harsh, bright, and uncompromising. Clifford slid down the wall, clutching his bruised ribs, gasping for air that suddenly smelled clean and heavily oxygenated. Across the room, Rowan was still clinging to the reactor casing, bathed in the golden light. The alien looked at the humming core, then looked across the vast chamber at the bruised, bleeding human sitting in the wreckage of broken glass and melted wire. Clifford managed a weak, blood-stained grin and threw up a thumbs up. They were alive. Outpost Jericho had died, and in its place, Clifford had built a chimera. And it was hungry. Heat baked into the carbon-scored deck plating, rising in shimmering, oily waves. Clifford didn't move for a long time. He just lay flat on his back, letting the synthetic, aggressive warmth of the butchered fusion core seep into his bruised spine. The reactor thrummed behind its reinforced casing, a heavy, syncopated vibration that rattled the silver fillings in Clifford's molars. It wasn't the elegant, silent hum of architect technology anymore. It sounded like an ancient diesel engine chewing on gravel. It sounded human. Clifford pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until sparks danced in his vision. Every muscle fiber in his body felt like frayed piano wire. His right hand, wrapped in the filthy, blood-stiffened rag, pulsed with a dull, sickening throb. Burned nerve endings were starting to wake up, screaming their displeasure. A heavy, unnatural footstep hit the deck near his head. Clifford cracked one eye open. Rowan stood over him, leaning heavily against the crystalline guardrail. The alien mercenary looked like a walking corpse. The cyan blood had dried into a crusty, iridescent shell over the biofoam on his side, and his dark, segmented armor was covered in grey dust. But those solid black eyes were sharp, scanning the cavernous room with practiced tactical paranoia. Rowan nudged the toe of Clifford's boot with his own. He pointed up toward the ceiling, then made a sweeping motion with his long arm. "Yeah, I know," Clifford rasped, rolling painfully onto his side and using his good hand to push himself up. "Power's on, but the brain is asleep. We need the command deck. We need to see what else is broken before this whole jerry-rigged monstrosity melts down." The station was protesting its resurrection. Outpost Jericho had been designed for fluid organic energy transfer. Ramming raw, unmodulated human voltage through its nervous system was the equivalent of pumping adrenaline into a severe hypertensive. The translucent vein-like tubes running along the bulkheads were no longer glowing their serene oceanic blue. They pulsed with an angry, jaundiced yellow, the liquid inside boiling and hissing where Clifford's crude copper splices bypassed the safety relays. They began the long climb up the central transit spire. The anti-grav elevators were offline, dead under the incompatible power frequency, leaving them with the emergency access ladders. It was an agonizing ascent. The air in the spire tasted heavily of ozone-burning plastic and the dry metallic tang of oxidized copper. Clifford climbed with his left hand, and his knees grunting with every upward heave. His burned right hand was tucked into his jacket, practically useless. Below him, Rowan climbed in silence, his extra leg joints clicking rhythmically against the metal rungs. Clifford's mind wandered as exhaustion set in. He thought of Tobias again. The captain was likely a week away by now, comfortably burning toward the core worlds. Tobias would file the paperwork. He'd look somber in the debriefing. He'd probably even write a letter to Clifford's sister, back on Mars, filled with carefully constructed platitudes about duty and unavoidable sacrifice. A sharp spike of nausea rolled through Clifford's stomach, tasting of old bile and lithium dust. He spat down the shaft. He wasn't a martyr. He was a grease monkey who got left holding the bag. The realization that he didn't even have a noble reason to die made him grip the next rung hard enough to strip the skin from his palm. Almost there, Clifford muttered, pulling himself onto the grating of the alpha deck. He collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving. Rowan hauled himself up a second later, stumbling and catching himself on a smooth obsidian support column. The alien let out a low rattling wheeze, sliding down the column until he was sitting his hand, pressed over the purple biofoam on his ribs. They sat in the dim, yellow-lit corridor, two broken things dragging themselves through a dying machine. Clifford fumbled in his cargo pocket with his left hand, pulling out a squashed, silver-wrapped ration bar. It was peanut butter and sawdust standard military issue. He bit off half, chewing the dry, chalky mass, and tossed the rest to Rowan. The alien caught it, sniffing the wrapper suspiciously. He took a tiny bite, his mandibles shifting beneath his grey skin. He paused, looked at the bar, and then shoved the entire thing into his mouth, chewing rapidly. Clifford let out a dry, hacking laugh. Yeah, tastes like cardboard, doesn't it? Keeps you moving, though. He pulled himself up, using the bulkhead. The doors to the command deck stood at the end of the hall. They were massive, seamless slabs of black metal, completely devoid of keypads or handles. Clifford didn't bother looking for a terminal. He pulled out his trusty magnetic pry bar, wedged it into the micro seam between the doors, and leaned his weight into it. Nothing happened. The electromagnetic lock was fully engaged, drawing directly from the newly awakened core. "Damn it!" Clifford hissed, kicking the door. The vibration sent a shockwave of pain up his leg. Rowan pushed himself up. He limped over to the door, placing his large grey hands flat against the black metal. He closed his eyes. A low, subsonic vibration began in the alien's chest, a deep humming that Clifford felt in the soles of his boots. The yellow energy pulsing in the conduits around the doorframe began to flicker. Rowan was doing something to the frequency. He was talking to the lock, bypassing the crude human energy with an organic override. With a heavy grinding thud, the electromagnetic seal broke. The doors hissed, parting sluggishly to reveal the nerve center of Outpost Jericho. The command deck smelled of ancient stagnant air and ozone. It was a massive circular amphitheater. Tiered rows of sleek crystalline consoles cascaded down toward a central holotank. The tank was currently a dead pool of black glass. But as Clifford and Rowan stepped over the threshold, the room reacted to the raw heat of the fusion core below. The consoles didn't boot up with the elegant cascading blue light of the architects. They sparked, violently snapping into existence with harsh, glaring yellow light. Lines of alien text scrolled frantically across the screens, corrupted and fragmented by the brutal human energy forcing them awake. Clifford limped down the central aisle, his eyes scanning the chaotic displays. "All right, Jericho," Clifford said, his voice hushed in the vast space. "Let's see how badly I mangled your brain." He reached the primary command chair, a throne of molded biosynthetic resin. He didn't sit. Instead, he dropped his heavy canvas tool bag onto the seat and pulled out his diagnostic tablet. He began stripping wires, preparing to bridge his tablet into the main sensor array. Rowan took a perimeter sweep. The mercenary moved with slow, deliberate caution, his black eyes darting across the shadows. He found a weapons locker on the far wall. The biometric lock was fried, bleeding sparks. Rowan simply gripped the handle and ripped the door off its hinges with a sickening screech of tearing metal. He pulled out a heavy, blocky plasma rifle, checking the thermal cell. "Keep an eye on the motion trackers if you can read them," Clifford called out, splicing a bundle of optic fibers into a copper relay. "I'm going to try to force a wide-band sensor ping. We need to know if Tobias left us a parting gift in orbit, or if the architects left automated defenses." He jammed the connection together. The central holotank hissed, spraying a fine mist of static into the air before igniting. A crude, three-dimensional topographical map of the local sector materialized. It wasn't the flawless high-fidelity render the architects were known for. It was jagged rendering in wireframe orange and yellow, filled with static and blind spots. Clifford leaned over the tank, squinting through the digital snow. Local space is clear, no ships in orbit, no incoming warp signatures. He exhaled a long, shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were truly alone. The panic should have returned, but instead an immense, heavy weariness settled over him. They had a station. They had power. But they had no food, beyond a few days of rations, no way to call for help, without broadcasting a beacon that would attract scavengers, or worse, and a core that was slowly eating the station's conduits, alive. Then a sharp, piercing beep cut through the ambient hum of the deck. Clifford flinched. The sound didn't come from the alien consoles. It came from his diagnostic tablet. He snatched it up. A single weak green blip was flashing on the screen. It wasn't an external sensor reading. It was local telemetry. Internal. Rowan Clifford said, his voice tightening. The alien turned, lowering the plasma rifle slightly. "I've got a signal," Clifford said, staring at the screen. He tapped the display, struggling to isolate the frequency. His heart hammered against his bruised ribs. "It's an emergency transponder. Human military issue." He looked up at Rowan. The cynical spite that had been keeping him going faltered, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. "It's coming from Sector 4. The server farms," Clifford said, his jaw tightening. "Tobias didn't just leave me. He left someone else." Clifford grabbed his pry bar, his burned hand screaming in protest as he shoved it into his belt loop. He looked at the map, tracing the route through the station's corrupted veins. "Sector 4 is completely locked down," Clifford muttered, talking more to himself than to Rowan. "Bulkheads dropped when the core went offline. If they're in there, they've been breathing recycled exhaust for the last 10 hours. Rowan approached the holotank. He looked at the flashing green blip, then looked at Clifford. The alien didn't need translation to understand the sudden, frantic energy radiating from the human. Rowan hefted the plasma rifle, giving a single curt nod. The trek to Sector 4 took them through the belly of the data processing ring. The air here was freezing, entirely bypassed by Clifford's crude environmental patch. Frost coated the black metal walls, and their breath plumed in thick white clouds. They reached the primary bulkhead, sealing off the server farms. It was a massive blast-rated door, 3 feet thick and immovable. Clifford slapped his tablet against the control panel. "Locked tight. Dead in the water. The local grid here is completely fried." He pressed his ear against the freezing metal of the door. Silence. Total, absolute silence. "Hey!" Clifford yelled, banging his heavy pry bar against the steel. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the frozen corridor. "Anyone in there, sound off." Nothing. Clifford cursed violently, kicking the door. He stepped back, looking at the structural supports. "Rowan, I can't bypass this. It's mechanical. The deadbolts are dropped." Rowan stepped forward. He inspected the heavy steel hinges, running a grey hand over the frosted metal. He stepped back, raising the plasma rifle. He dialed the thermal output to maximum the weapon, whining as it drew power. Wait, Clifford shouted, shielding his eyes. "You'll cook whoever's inside." Rowan ignored him. He didn't aim at the door. He aimed at the upper support struts, anchoring the frame to the ceiling. He pulled the trigger. A blinding, searing beam of superheated plasma erupted from the rifle, striking the struts. The metal instantly turned slag white, melting like butter. Sparks showered the corridor, forcing Clifford to duck behind a supply crate. Rowan held the beam for 5 agonizing seconds, severing the upper anchors. The massive door groaned, the structural integrity fatally compromised. It began to tilt outward, screaming, as the heavy deadbolts twisted inside their housings. With a deafening crash that shook dust from the ceiling, The blast door fell forward, slamming onto the deck plating. A wave of stale, heat-soaked air rolled out of the server farm. It smelled of burnt silicon sweat and fear. Clifford coughed, waving the smoke away, and stepped over the fallen door. The server room was a graveyard of blackened racks and dangling wires. At the far end, huddled beneath a secondary console, a figure sat wrapped in a silver emergency blanket. The figure flinched as Clifford's flashlight beam hit them, raising a trembling hand to block the light. "Who's there?" A voice croaked, ragged and raw. Clifford lowered the beam. Sitting amidst the wreckage, clutching a stripped-down datapad like a lifeline, was Waylon Turner, the crew's junior astrogation officer. He was barely 22, his face smeared with grease, his eyes wide and hollow with shock. "Turner?" Clifford asked, his voice catching in his throat. Waylon stared at the bruised, bloodied engineer, then at the towering, grey-skinned alien mercenary standing behind him, rifle in hand. Waylon let out a choked, hysterical sob. "Maury, I thought I was dead. The captain, he said the core was going to blow. He sealed the door to protect the navigation data upload." Clifford's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground together. Tobias hadn't just abandoned Waylon, he had locked him in an oven to save a hard drive. The spite that had been sustaining Clifford flared into a roaring, uncontrollable inferno. "Come on, kid," Clifford said softly, reaching down with his good hand to pull Waylon up. "You're not dead yet, and neither am I. We're going to take this station, and we're going to make Tobias Mercer regret the day he learned how to count odds." Metallic grit coated Clifford's tongue, tasting intensely of lithium and burnt copper. Abandoned. Left to suffocate in the decaying belly of outpost Jericho, 3 million light-years from a sun he recognized. His crew had stripped the escape pods, taking the last oxygen reserves with them. Survival wasn't just statistically improbable, it was mathematically impossible. Yet as the station's core hummed its dying breath, a stubborn, jagged spite took root in his chest. Dying was easy. Spite required engineering. Waylon shook uncontrollably, his teeth clicking together like loose bearings. Clifford draped his own filthy, oil-stained jacket over the kid's shoulders. Smells of scorched silicone and stale sweat clung to the fabric. Coughing, the young astrogator pulled it tight. "Tobias," Waylon started, his voice cracking into a dry wheeze. "Said the core was cascading," Tobias lied. Clifford grunted, kneeling to inspect the shattered terminal. "Captain needed that nav data uploaded without you trying to steal a seat in the pod." Anger tasted like battery acid on the back of Clifford's tongue. Bile rose in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Focusing on the ruined server racks offered a distraction from the throbbing agony in his burned right hand. Copper wire had fused into the synthetic skin of his glove. Peeling it off wasn't an option, unless he wanted to lose the flesh underneath. Rowan stood guard by the melted doorway. Black eyes scanned the dark corridors. Clicking sounds emanated from the alien's throat, a rhythmic clicking that almost sounded comforting. Clifford tapped the kid's shoulder. "Can you walk, kid?" Waylon nodded, wiping a streak of black grease across his pale cheek. "Legs feel like jelly, but yeah." "Good," Clifford said, "because we need water, and we need it yesterday." Survival hinged on outlasting the station's immune response. Outpost Jericho treated the human power frequency like a virus. Conduits pulsed with an angry, jaundiced glow. Metal groaned constantly under the fluctuating thermal loads. Moving back toward the central hub felt like walking through the belly of a dying beast. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, thick with lithium dust and rust. Clifford caught a drop on his tongue. It tasted like pennies and poison. Spitting it out, he kept moving. Water reclamation sat 3 decks down. Accessing it required climbing through a ventilation shaft that smelled distinctly of rotting kelp and ammonia. Clifford forced Waylon to go first. Rowan followed his extra leg joints, making the cramped ascent awkward and loud. Inside the reclamation plant, the devastation was complete. Alien filtration bladders lay ruptured on the grated deck. Vats of thick grey sludge dominated the center of the room. Waylon stared at the mess in horror. "We can't drink that." "Not yet," Clifford muttered. Pulling his heavy canvas bag forward, he started digging. Tools clattered against the metal grating. Wrench hydrospanner rolls of crude copper wiring, and a smashed filtration unit from his own suit. "Kid, rip those copper coils out of that dead console," Clifford ordered, pointing with his good hand. "Rowan, I need you to lift that heavy vat cover." Working gave them purpose. Waylon's hands shook as he tore at the alien machinery, slicing his knuckles on sharp, crystalline edges. But he didn't stop. Rowan hauled the massive resin lid off the primary sludge tank, grunting with exertion. Clifford butchered his suit's filter, bypassing the digital safeties and hardwiring the intake directly into the raw copper coils. Sparks flew as he connected the makeshift rig to a flickering power node on the wall. "Hold your breath," Clifford warned. Plunging the intake hose into the grey sludge, he hit the power. The pump screamed. Mud sucked through the tubes, violently vibrating the entire rig. Clear, slightly yellowish water began to spit out of the outflow valve, splashing into a cracked resin bucket. Clifford scooped a handful of the tepid liquid. It smelled like sulfur and old boots. Swallowing it down required immense willpower, but it stayed in his stomach. "Drink," Clifford croaked, pushing the bucket toward Waylon. "Tastes awful, but it won't kill you." Waylon drank, greedily spilling water down his chin. Rowan simply observed, refusing the bucket. The alien mercenary unclipped a small metallic flask from his utility belt, taking a measured sip of whatever viscous blue fluid remained inside. Resting against the cold tank, Clifford examined his mangled hand. Infection was setting in. Red streaks crawled up his forearm, mapping the veins beneath the dirt. Pain radiated in deep, sickening pulses. "We survive the cold. We survive the thirst," he thought bitterly, just to die of sepsis. Spite remained his only real fuel. Dying here would validate Tobias's calculations. Surviving was the ultimate middle finger. "All right, Turner," Clifford said, his voice raspy and thin. "You held on to that data pad for a reason. Tell me you have something useful in there." Waylon wiped his mouth, pulling the device from his tunic. "I saved the telemetry logs. I know exactly where Tobias is heading." Dim yellow emergency strobes painted the command deck in sickly, nervous shadows. Hours had bled into an indistinguishable slurry of pain and frantic labor. Clifford sat slouched in the command chair, shivering violently. Sepsis was winning this war in his bloodstream. Sweating profusely, he stared at the fragmented, topographical map floating in the hollow tank. Waylon sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by gutted cables. The kid had stripped the copper wiring from a dozen secondary consoles, weaving a massive chaotic adapter to interface his datapad with Jericho's long-range communication array. Rowan stood silently near the viewport, staring out into the absolute black of deep space. Tyan blood had fully crusted over the mercenary's side, sealing the wound, but his breathing remained shallow and ragged. "I got it." Waylon suddenly gasped, his fingers flying across the cracked glass of his datapad. "I broke through the encryption on the ComBoy logs." Clifford forced his heavy eyes open. "Talk to me, kid. Where is that bastard?" "Tobias set a course for the Acheron relay," Waylon explained, reading the scrolling green text. "It's a civilian sector. He's going to dump the nav data to Fleet Command and play the grieving hero." A dry, rattling cough tore through Clifford's chest. Tasting copper, he spat onto the dark floor. "How far out is he?" 3 days, Waylon answered. But we have a problem. The moment we power up the long-range array to send a distress signal, Tobias will detect the energy spike. He's monitoring the sector for architect patrols. If he sees us broadcast... Clifford started, his voice trailing off as a wave of dizziness hit him. He'll know we aren't dead. Wayland finished, his voice trembling again. He'll turn around. He has ship-to-ship missiles, Clifford. He can't afford witnesses. Silence fell over the cavernous deck, heavy and suffocating. The station's core thrummed below them, a relentless heartbeat of stolen human energy. Clifford looked at his ruined, infected hand. He looked at the traumatized kid shivering on the floor. Finally, he looked at Rowan. The alien met his gaze, solid black eyes revealing a deep, violent understanding. We don't send address signal. Clifford rasped, a grim, jagged smile splitting his cracked lips. We send a hunting call. Wayland stared in confusion. I don't understand. Jericho wasn't just a prison kid, Clifford said, pulling himself upright with immense effort. It was a listening post. It was designed to intercept and amplify signals. What happens if we bypass the broadcast limiters and dump the entire output of our rigged fusion core directly into the comms array? Wayland's eyes widened in horror. The feedback loop would tear the array apart. It would create a localized electromagnetic pulse massive enough to blind every ship within 10 light-years. It's an EMP bomb. Exactly, Clifford whispered, leaning forward. Tobias relies on his sensors. He relies on his navigation computers. We blind him. We fry his ship's brain while he's in deep transit. But we'd fry ourselves, Wayland argued, panic rising in his throat. The feedback will overload the station's grid. Life support, gravity, everything will go dark permanently. Not if we decouple the command deck from the main grid. Clifford countered, his engineering mind firing through the fever haze. We isolate our power. Let the rest of the station take the hit. It's a gamble. A massive, stupid gamble. Rowan stepped away from the window. The tall mercenary walked over to the holotank, pointing a long grey finger at the projected flight path of Tobias's ship. Clicking softly, Rowan mimed an explosion with his hands, then pointed to his own chest, nodding once. The alien understood the math. Vengeance carried a price. Clifford pulled his magnetic pry bar from his belt, tossing it to Wayland. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the deck. Kid, I need you to go down to the primary junction, beneath this deck. Clifford ordered, his voice brooking no argument. When I give the signal, you shatter the main conduit coupling. Physically sever our connection to the lower levels. Wayland hesitated, staring at the pry bar. Clifford, you're dying. You can't wire the comms array fast enough in your condition. Watch me, Clifford growled. Pushing himself out of the chair, agony flared through his entire right side. He stumbled, catching himself on the console. Gritting his teeth, he pulled his utility knife with his left hand. Rowan, Clifford said, looking at the mercenary. I need your hands. I'm going to tell you exactly which wires to cut and which ones to fuse. The alien gave a curt nod, slinging the plasma rifle over his back. Work began with frantic, desperate speed. Sweat dripped into Clifford's eyes as he guided Rowan's massive hands through the delicate circuitry of the primary communications console. Bypassing the safety limiters required stripping raw high-voltage lines and burying them directly into the station's crystalline amplifiers. Every time Rowan forced a human copper wire into an architect node, the console screamed in protest. Sparks showered over them, burning tiny holes in Clifford's remaining clothes. The ambient temperature spiked. Warning sirens, a discordant alien howling, began to blare through the deck. Hold it there! Clifford yelled over the noise, pointing a trembling finger. Strip the casing and jam it into the blue fluid. Rowan ripped the rubber casing with his teeth, shoving the bare wire into the pulsing gelatinous matrix. Violent yellow light erupted from the console. The holotank shattered, exploding in a shower of black glass. "It's primed!" Clifford screamed, clutching his infected arm to his chest. "Turner, get in position!" Wayland grabbed the pry bar and sprinted for the floor hatch, disappearing into the maintenance crawl space beneath the deck. Clifford stumbled back to the command chair, pulling his diagnostic tablet into his lap. The screen was flashing a critical failure warning. The core output was rising exponentially, funneling directly into the dish outside. Target locked on his telemetry. Clifford breathed, his vision blurring at the edges. 30 seconds to critical mass. Metal groaned around them. The floor vibrated so violently Clifford thought his teeth would shatter. Jericho was screaming, pushed far beyond any structural tolerance. 10 seconds! Clifford roared over the deafening mechanical shriek. "Turner, stand by!" Hovering his hand over the manual execute switch, Clifford closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Tobias Mercer was out there in the dark, believing he had calculated every variable. Tobias forgot one thing. Engineers don't just fix machines. Sometimes they break them on purpose. "Execute." Clifford slammed his hand down. "Severing." Wayland's voice echoed from below, followed immediately by the sickening crunch of metal smashing against crystal. The universe tore in half. White heat replaced the universe. An absolute, soundless flash of pure electromagnetic fury ripped outward from the station's central array. Clifford felt the shockwave not in his ears, but in his marrow. The deck plating beneath his boots bucked upward, a steel tsunami throwing him violently against the command chair. His ribs snapped. He didn't hear the bone break. The EMP had generated a pressure wave that pushed all oxygen out of his lungs, leaving him gasping in a sudden, terrifying vacuum. Then gravity died. Weightlessness took hold instantly. Debris shattered obsidian glass, melted copper wire tools, and drops of Clifford's own blood lifted off the deck, suspending in the dead air like a gruesome mobile. The harsh yellow emergency strobes flickered once, violently bright, and blew out. Absolute crushing darkness slammed into the command deck. Only the silence remained. It wasn't the quiet of a calm night. It was a suffocating, heavy deadness. The ambient thrum of the fusion core, the heartbeat that had been vibrating in Clifford's teeth for the last 10 hours, was gone. Clifford drifted in the black, unable to tell up from down. Pain radiated from his chest and his infected arm, a dull, throbbing rhythm that served as his only anchor to reality. He closed his eyes. The gamble was over. Either they had isolated the deck in time, or they had just cooked themselves in the largest microwave in the sector. "Turner." Clifford tried to speak, but it came out as a wet, ragged wheeze. He tasted iron. A sharp chemical hiss sliced through the dark. A crack of light flared red-harsh and desperately human. Rowan floated near the ruined holotank, holding a snapped emergency flare. The crimson light cast long demonic shadows across the alien mercenary's grey features. He kicked off the bulkhead, swimming awkwardly through the zero-G environment, and grabbed Clifford by the collar of his ruined jumpsuit, arresting his uncontrolled spin. A heavy metallic clatter echoed from beneath the deck. The floor hatch swung open, squealing on warped hinges. Wayland pulled himself up, coughing violently, a flashlight gripped in his teeth. "It held," Wayland gasped, shining the beam across the floating debris. The physical sever held. The surge blew back into the lower levels. "We're isolated." Clifford gritted his teeth as Rowan strapped him into the command chair, using a length of nylon webbing. "The core." "Fried," Wayland said, wiping a mixture of sweat and grease from his forehead. "Everything below Deck 3 is a fused hunk of slag. Jericho is completely dead." "Good." Clifford let his head roll back against the resin headrest. Fever was cooking his brain. The red streaks on his right arm had turned a violent, bruised purple, the skin hot to the touch. Sensors. Check the passive array. Wayland kicked over to the secondary console. He had wired a standalone battery pack to a small, cracked monitor, specifically for this moment. He toggled the switch. The screen flickered to life, bathing his pale, terrified face in a pale green glow. Passive optical is online. Wayland muttered, his fingers tapping the glass. Scanning the Acheron trajectory. There's a lot of interference. The pulse created a massive ion cloud. Static hissed from the tiny speaker. Clifford forced himself to keep his eyes open. His breathing was shallow, every inhalation grinding broken ribs against his lungs. Got something, Wayland whispered, his voice trembling. It's faint. No thermal signature, no transponder. Just a mass shadow drifting off the main transit lane. Rowan floated up behind the kid, leaning over his shoulder to stare at the screen. The alien clicked his mandibles, a low, satisfied sound. It's him, Wayland confirmed, looking back at Clifford. Tobias, his ship is totally dark. The EMP stripped their shielding and fried their main drive. They're dead in the water, Clifford. Just drifting. A dark, ugly laugh bubbled up in Clifford's throat, turning into an agonizing cough that sprayed a fine mist of blood into the air. The spite had reached its logical conclusion. Tobias Mercer, the pragmatist, the man who played the odds, was now sitting in a freezing metal coffin, miles from anywhere, with zero chance of rescue. Calculations, Clifford rasped, a delirious smile twisting his face. He forgot to calculate for me. The adrenaline began to crash. The cold of deep space was already creeping back into the isolated deck, seeping through the hull. Clifford looked at his right arm. The swelling had reached his bicep. Sepsis wasn't a threat anymore. It was an executioner, and it was tightening the noose. Clifford, Wayland said, pushing away from the console. The kid's voice sounded muffled, distant. Clifford, your arm. We need to do something. Nothing to do, kid. Clifford whispered, his vision narrowing into a dark tunnel. No medbay. No antibiotics. Station's dead. Rowan moved suddenly. The tall alien pushed off the floor, gliding toward Clifford. He unsheathed a long, serrated combat knife from his thigh rig. The blade was dark, stained with old cyan blood. Wayland panicked, floating backward. Hey, what are you doing? Rowan ignored him. He grabbed Clifford's infected arm, pinning it against the armrest. The alien locked eyes with Clifford. Those solid black orbs held no malice, only brutal, pragmatic necessity. Rowan pointed at the purple, rotting flesh, then pointed the knife at the joint just below Clifford's elbow. Clifford swallowed hard. The alien wanted to amputate. It was a crude, filthy solution that would likely kill him from shock anyway, but it was the only math that made sense. Do it, Clifford croaked, biting down hard on the collar of his jacket. Wayland screamed in protest, but Rowan didn't hesitate. The alien raised the blade. Agony didn't adequately describe the sensation. It was a complete structural collapse of the nervous system. Clifford woke to the smell of burning meat and ozone. He was strapped to the floor plating. Gravity had returned a weak, staggering fraction of standard pull, but enough to keep him pinned to the deck. He turned his head. Wayland was asleep, slumped against the bulkhead, clutching his datapad like a teddy bear. The kid looked 10 years older, dark circles bruised beneath his closed eyes. Clifford slowly looked down at his right arm. It ended 3 inches below the elbow. The stump wasn't wrapped in bandages. Instead, it was encased in a hardened, translucent block of violent purple biofoam. Intertwined within the foam, pulsing with a faint, sickly yellow light, were thin strands of alien crystalline conduits. Rowan sat cross-legged across the room, meticulously cleaning his serrated knife with a filthy rag. The mercenary looked up, catching Clifford's gaze. He pointed at Clifford's stump, then pointed to a dismantled console nearby. They hadn't just amputated. Rowan had cauterized the wound using raw thermal bleed from a severed power node, then sealed it with the same biofoam that was currently holding his own ribs together. It was a butchery of human and alien biology, completely unsterile and utterly horrific. But Clifford was breathing. His skin was cool. The fever had broken. "You're a terrible doctor." Clifford rasped, his throat dry as sandpaper. Rowan clicked his mandibles and went back to cleaning his knife. Over the next month, survival became a brutal, mundane routine. Outpost Jericho was a corpse, but it was a very large corpse. They scavenged. They tore down walls to find hidden pockets of emergency rations. They jury-rigged a localized gravitational field on the command deck, using a bypassed secondary battery bank. Clifford learned to work with one hand. He adapted. He built a prosthetic out of scraped conduit piping and a magnetic gripping vice wiring the crude metal claw directly into the exposed nerves of his stump. Every time he used it, a jolt of static pain shot up his shoulder, a constant reminder of the price he had paid. They fixed the water reclaimer, creating a closed-loop system that tasted perpetually of sulfur and rust. They ripped up the deck plating in the captain's ready room, using the raw dirt from the hydroponics bay to plant the seeds they found in the station's emergency stores. It wasn't a rescue. It was an occupation. 3 months after the EMP, Clifford stood by the massive viewport of the command deck. The glass was cracked, sealed with thick patches of grey resin. Outside, the endless, indifferent black of deep space stretched into infinity. Waylon walked up beside him, carrying 2 metallic cups filled with tepid recycled water. The kid handed one to Clifford. Waylon had grown a scraggly beard. His eyes hardened, the naive astrogator, replaced by a hardened scavenger. "I checked the passive sensors again this morning," Waylon said, quietly staring out at the stars. Clifford took a sip of the foul water. "And the shadow is still there, trapped in the Acheron drift," Waylon replied, leaning against the cold glass. "Orbiting a dead gas giant. No power signatures. No heat. Tobias Mercer was a ghost, locked in a frozen tomb of his own making. He had calculated the odds, decided Clifford was an acceptable loss, and condemned himself to the void in the process." Clifford looked down at his crude mechanical claw. He flexed the magnetic vice. It screeched, metal grinding against metal. It was ugly. It was painful. It was undeniably human. "He left us a perfectly good station, kid," Clifford said, a cynical, jagged smirk playing across his scarred face. "Seems a shame to let it go to waste." Rowan stepped out from the shadows of the corridor, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the deck. The alien mercenary walked over to the viewport, standing shoulder to shoulder with the 2 humans. He looked at the vast expanse of space, then looked at Clifford and Waylon, offering a single rhythmic click of his throat. They were monsters now, chimeras, built of stubborn flesh and stolen wire, ruling over a kingdom of rust and spite. They hadn't just survived the dark. They had dragged it into the light and made it theirs. If you enjoyed this descent into raw, cynical survival and spite-fueled engineering, please smash that like button. It tells the algorithm you want more grounded, gritty sci-fi where humanity isn't just surviving, but aggressively fighting back against the odds. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow sci-fi lovers who appreciate a darker, more realistic take on the HFY genre. Finally, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming deep space dramas. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching, and stay stubborn out there in the void.